is that the guidance to pay review bodies by the Liberal Democrats will, firstly, for the first 2 years, 16, 17, 17, 18, of the next Parliament, until the deficit is dealt with, the guidance will say that the pay settlements should at least keep pace with prices. So, be certainly in no shape or form a real terms pay cut, but should at least match prices. So the pay review bodies will be free to make recommendations to pay public sector workers above the rise in prices. Thereafter, the guidance would be even more explicit. It would say that the pay settlements have to be more generous than the increase in prices. So they will be real terms increases in each year after the books have been balanced. And I just think that is fair if you look back at the very real sacrifices that 5.5 million public sector workers have made, particularly, by the way, at the beginning of the Parliament, because you'll remember the first 2 years was in effect a sort of cash freeze in public sector pay, but at a time when inflation spiked. I mean, at one point it spiked well over 5%, and so that was a real, squeeze which was felt by millions and millions of public sector workers and of course the families who are dependent on them. And I think that is right why we now spell out how we'll turn a page on that period, that lengthy period of pay restraint. Yeah.
Vicky Young, BBC News. What impact will a rising pay bill have on the rest of the health and education budgets? Because surely if more is going on salaries, that will have an impact on services.
What it means is, as I was explaining earlier, that in terms of the savings that are required from central government departments to balance the books, we are simply ruling out that pay will feature in that. Now, thankfully, inflation is relatively low at the moment and is projected to be to remain low for some time. So that obviously makes it, that makes the whole system more sustainable, and affordable and deliverable. I think if you consider that the contribution of pay restraint to balancing the books so far has been 12 billion, if you consider that we've already provided the protections for health and education in a way which doesn't involve any pay restraint in those two areas, actually the kind of, how can I put it, the savings that you are foregoing by not including further pay restraint are pretty modest compared to the total savings still required.
Jo Coburn, BBC News, or I should say Jo Coburn, The Daily Politics. I might as well get my title right. The Tories have been accused of splurging on unfunded spending on the NHS, for example, and now here, just 2 weeks out from polling day, you're promising pay rises for the public sector based on nothing but the hope of further growth.
Well, obviously, like all parties, we make assumptions, or rather people make assumptions for us about projected inflation going forward and growth. I mean, that's what everyone. I mean, you can't plan for a future without some plans for the future, and those are based on the projections of growth and inflation that are provided to us by the Office of Budget Responsibility. So they are not our assumptions. They are assumptions independently arrived at, and that's the way governments and parties work across the democratic world. You have to make certain assumptions, and as I say, given that the level of further Whitehall savings that we deem to be necessary are much more modest than the Conservatives, because we're also at the same time asking more of the wealthiest through the tax system. Given that those Whitehall savings on an annual basis are half of what we have already achieved just in this year, given that inflation is going to be low, given that we've already provided or set out plans to provide the protections in education and health which constitute more than half of the public sector pay bill, this is eminently affordable, and it is right. It is simply right to say to those millions of people working in the public sector that after half a decade of considerable self-sacrifice, they should understand what how there is light at the end of the tunnel, and their pay is now going to be restored over time to normal levels.
It'll be seen as a bribe, won't it?
No, I hope not. I think that everybody, at least certainly the Liberal Democrats, believes that the restraint that we've asked of people in the public sector was a temporary measure as part of the contribution of the public sector to balance the books, and also, by the way, doing so in a way which minimises or sought to minimise the job losses in the public sector. There have been considerable job losses. There would have been considerably more if pay restraint had not been included in the deficit reduction effort. But for us, as David said, and this of course is where there's a huge ideological divide between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, this was always an uncomfortable but unavoidable and necessary measure as part of a balanced approach to dealing with the deficit. For the Conservatives, it is just the start of an ideological paring back of the state's commitment to public services. And this is why they have taken this very hardline ideological choice. And it is a choice. There's nothing, there's nothing sort of inevitable about this. Choice that even after the books have been balanced in 2017-18, they'll still carry on cutting. That is their choice. A choice, by the way, which would be made considerably more spine-chilling if they go into government, as is perfectly possible, with a ragbag of right-wingers from their own backbenches, from the DUP and UKIP. And just on that point, I have governed with George Osborne and David Cameron for 5 years now, and I've seen at every single turn that when the right wing of the Conservative backbenches start cutting up rough, they buckle. The evidence is there for you to see, is that the Conservative Party leadership always runs scared of its own right wing. We had a warning yesterday from John Major, quite rightly, by the way, the warnings about a Labour SNP alliance. John Major's a very decent man, but he knows from his own time in Downing Street what it's like to basically be held hostage by the right wing of your own party. And that is now a very, very real prospect. And people simply aren't focusing enough. And dare I say, you're not focusing enough on this very real rival threat to the Labour SNP alliance, which is consuming everybody's attention. And it's really time that we call out the Conservative Party leadership for their secret plans. You saw this morning, not so secret, David Cameron appealing to UKIP to basically enter into a rapprochement with the Conservative Party. It's happening before our eyes. And is that how we want to be governed? And I certainly wouldn't want it on my conscience for people not to be forcefully warned about the real dangers of a right-wing blue kip alliance governing our country in the future.
Thank you. Ben Riley-Smith from The Telegraph. How big a priority is this policy for you? Can you confirm today that you would not go into coalition with any party that proposes to freeze or cut public sector?
Well, we have said, first line on the front page of our manifesto, we have said that we must balance the books. Of course, we understand, unlike Labour, that not balancing the books is unfair to our kids and our grandkids, to the next generation. But we've got to do so fairly. And this is an absolutely perfect example of how you do it fairly. Don't ask yet more of 5.5 million public sector workers who've made already a £12 billion contribution to balancing the books. So it is very much at the heart of a fair approach to balancing the books. And we wouldn't, and David and the team who worked on drafting up the manifesto would not have decided to put that in the front page of our manifesto if it wasn't a very real priority for us.
Joe Watts, Evening Standard. I'm assuming that the inflationary increases you're talking about over the next 2 years will be at the rate of CPI inflation. And if that's the case, why do you see fit to allow rail fares to rise at the much faster RPI rates while only allowing public sector pay to rise at the slower CPI rate?
Well, the reason why RPI is used, as you know, is to try and strike this very difficult balance between making rail travel affordable for rail travellers and commuters, but also making sure that we generate enough investment in a rail infrastructure which is creaking. And I think it is an extraordinary achievement, actually, that despite the huge economic pressures we've been under, it is this coalition government that has announced the biggest revamping and investment programme capital investment programme in rail, not least through the franchisees, in our railway infrastructure since the Victorian era. But as you know, and as you'll remember from Norman Baker's time in the Department for Transport, the Liberal Democrats have been very much at the forefront of making sure that any sort of RPI plus increases in rail fares are brought back to the very bare minimum, because of course commuters, most especially but not exclusively into London, are facing very high ticket prices, and I can understand their concern about the future rise in those commuter prices.
Matt Chorley from Mail Online. I wonder what you made of David Cameron's announcement today on childcare. He seems to be trying to outbid you in terms of the number of free hours that the Tories are promising? And also wondered what you made of the allegations about your good friend Grant Shapps.
Well, Grant Shapps has fervently denied that he had anything to do, that he himself does not have the time, apparently, to edit his own Wikipedia entry. And look, I'm prepared to believe him. I mean, it just could have been someone else. Michael Green, for instance, could have. Boom, boom. On the first, look, the Conservatives aren't doing anything to help the parents of 2-year-old toddlers with the childcare costs for 2-year-old toddlers. They're doing nothing to help the mum and the dad, the parents who go back to work after 9 months or a year and have to wait under the Conservative scheme for 2 whole years before they get any help from a future Conservative government on childcare costs. So, what is the point of giving help only to families when a child turns 3, but nothing actually in those crucial early years for many, many working families where the childcare pressures are the greatest? And that is why our priority is, of course, to move to, over time, as money allows, to a 20-hour, that would be a serious amount of childcare, 20-hour entitlement for all 3- and 4-year-olds, all 2-year-olds, and also for the childcare costs of children between the point at which parents go back to work and that 2-year entitlement kicks in. That's our priority. And we would do it in the following steps. Our priority is firstly to roll out the entitlement to preschool support and childcare help with childcare costs to all families with 2-year-old toddlers. As you know, because of Liberal Democrats in government, we have extended it for the first time to 2-year-olds from families who are in the 40% lowest income of families across the country. So that's our first step, is to give it to all 2-year-olds. And then the next step for us would be to bridge that gap, that often financially crippling gap for working parents, that once they go back to work, that at that point they will get help with childcare costs, as well as, of course, from September this year, giving help to up to £2,000 per child through the tax-free childcare entitlement, which we will be introducing in autumn of this year. That seems to me to reflect a sort of Liberal Democrat understanding of the big pressures that a lot of families are under as they juggle work and family. The Conservatives, as far as I can make out, are just entering into a Dutch auction with the Labour Party, who just seem to be sort of racking up these ever more unsustainable commitments for 3- and 4-year-olds only. So I think our approach helps many more families when the help is most acutely needed. Anyone else? No? Okay, in that case, thank you very much. Thank you.